The woman sitting alone in the rain looked like she had lost everything, and Ethan Walker had no way of knowing that helping her would reopen a chapter of his life he thought had been buried forever. The storm arrived without warning that Thursday night. Sheets of rain swept across downtown Dallas, turning glass towers into blurry shadows behind curtains of water. Most people hurried toward parking garages or called rides home. Nobody wanted to stay outside longer than necessary. Ethan was no different. After finishing a late delivery shift, he pulled his aging pickup truck onto a quiet side street and checked the dashboard clock. It was nearly 11:30. Grace would already be asleep. The thought made him smile despite the exhaustion pulling at his shoulders. Every night followed the same rhythm. Work, bills, school lunches, homework, bedtime stories, then more work. Life had become a careful balancing act ever since Emily passed away 6 years earlier. Some days felt impossible, yet every morning he got up and did it again. Because Grace needed him. Because she was worth it. The rain intensified as he approached an intersection near one of the city's luxury hotels. Flashing lights reflected across puddles. Valets rushed between expensive cars. Guests disappeared through revolving doors. Ethan barely noticed any of it until he saw someone sitting alone on a stone bench near the curb. At first he assumed she was waiting for transportation. Then he realized she was not moving, not checking her phone, not looking around, just sitting there while rain soaked through her clothing. Something felt wrong. Ethan slowed. A black SUV pulled away from the hotel entrance. Two sharply dressed men emerged briefly from the lobby, glanced toward the woman, exchanged a few words, and walked away. Nobody stopped. Nobody helped. The woman remained where she was. Ethan drove another 20 yards before stopping completely. He rested both hands on the steering wheel. This was not his business. He was tired. He needed to get home. Yet something about the scene refused to leave him alone. After several seconds, he sighed quietly and pulled to the curb. Rain struck his jacket immediately as he stepped outside. Cold wind swept through the street. The woman looked up as he approached. Her eyes appeared unfocused. Not frightened, just exhausted. Deeply exhausted. "Ma'am?" Ethan asked gently. No response. He tried again. "Are you okay?" She blinked slowly. For a moment it seemed she was trying to remember where she was. "I am fine." The answer came softly, but it clearly was not true. Ethan noticed the expensive coat, the designer handbag resting beside her, the unmistakable signs of someone successful. Yet none of those things seemed to matter tonight. She looked completely alone. "Do you have someone coming for you?" he asked. She shook her head. "No." Rainwater dripped from her hair. Her hands trembled slightly. Ethan glanced toward the hotel entrance. Nobody appeared concerned. Nobody appeared to be looking for her. The city moved around them without slowing down. "Do you know where you live?" She laughed once. It was not a happy sound. "That is a strange question." "Maybe." Ethan offered a small smile. "Can you answer it?" Her expression shifted. Confusion crossed her face. Then frustration. Then sadness. For a brief second, Ethan saw something beyond exhaustion. Pain. The kind people spend years trying to hide. "I do," she said finally. "I just do not want to go there." The answer lingered between them. Ethan had heard something similar before. Years ago. Different person. Different circumstances. Same loneliness. Thunder rolled somewhere in the distance. Traffic lights changed colors across the empty intersection. The woman stared down at the wet pavement. "Everybody left," she whispered. Ethan was not sure whether she meant tonight or something much larger. Maybe she did not know either. He removed his jacket and carefully placed it around her shoulders. "Come on." She looked up. "Why?" Ethan shrugged. "Because nobody should sit alone in the rain." For several seconds, she simply stared at him, almost as if she could not understand the answer. Then she slowly stood. The expensive handbag slipped from her shoulder. Ethan caught it before it hit the ground. Together they walked toward the truck beneath the glow of streetlights and rain. Neither knew the other's name. Neither understood why their paths had crossed. Yet somewhere far beyond the storm, beyond the city, beyond everything either of them could see, a story that had begun years earlier was quietly beginning again. The drive across the city passed mostly in silence. Rain tapped steadily against the windshield while Ethan guided the old pickup through nearly empty streets. The woman sat quietly in the passenger seat, staring out the window as neon signs blurred into streaks of color. Every now and then she closed her eyes as if trying to escape a thought she could not outrun. Ethan did not ask questions. He had learned long ago that some people needed space more than advice, especially when pain was involved. The heater hummed softly inside the truck. Warm air slowly replaced the chill that had settled into her clothes. Several minutes passed before she finally spoke. "You do not even know my name." Ethan kept his eyes on the road. "That is true. Most people would ask. Most people probably would." She turned slightly toward him. "And you are not curious?" A faint smile appeared. Curious and entitled are different things. The answer seemed to catch her off guard. For the first time all evening, she looked directly at him. The streetlights illuminated tired eyes that carried far more than simple exhaustion. Ethan noticed the expression but said nothing. Whatever burden she was carrying clearly did not begin tonight. "My name is Olivia," she said quietly. "Ethan." Another silence followed. It felt less uncomfortable now. Outside, the storm continued rolling across the city. Eventually, Olivia gave him an address. Ethan recognized the neighborhood immediately. It was one of the wealthiest areas in Dallas. Large estates, private gates, perfect landscaping. A different world from the modest apartment complex where he lived with Grace. The realization explained some things. The designer clothes, the luxury hotel, the expensive handbag. Yet somehow it made her loneliness seem even stranger. When they arrived, iron gates opened automatically. The driveway curved through perfectly maintained grounds before ending in front of a massive home glowing beneath warm exterior lights. Ethan parked near the entrance. For a moment, neither moved. Olivia stared toward the house. "Home," she said softly. The word carried no happiness, only obligation. Ethan noticed. "Do you want me to wait until you get inside?" She looked surprised. "Why?" He shrugged. "Just making sure you are okay." Olivia studied him carefully. People usually wanted something from her. Access, influence, money, opportunity. The pattern had repeated itself for years. Yet this man seemed genuinely concerned about a stranger he had found sitting in the rain. It felt unfamiliar, almost suspicious. "You really expect nothing in return?" she asked. Ethan laughed quietly. "For driving someone home? Most people would. Then maybe most people need better hobbies." For the first time that night, Olivia smiled. It appeared briefly, but it was real. She opened the truck door and stepped outside. Rain had weakened to a light drizzle. Ethan waited while she walked toward the entrance. Halfway there, she stopped and turned back. "Thank you." Ethan nodded. "Good night, Olivia." She disappeared inside. The large front door closed behind her. Ethan shifted into reverse and headed home. By the time he reached his apartment complex, midnight had passed. The building stood quiet beneath the fading storm. He climbed the stairs and unlocked the door carefully. Inside, the apartment felt warm and familiar. Small, simple, home. A lamp remained on in the corner of the living room. Crayons and school papers covered part of the coffee table. A half-finished drawing sat beside a spelling worksheet. Ethan smiled immediately. Grace had probably insisted she would stay awake until he got home. She never succeeded. Sure enough, he found her asleep on the couch beneath a blanket. One small hand still rested on an open storybook. Ethan knelt beside her and gently brushed a strand of hair away from her face. Moments like this always made the exhaustion worth it. He carried her carefully to bed and tucked the blanket around her shoulders. Before leaving the room, he paused beside a framed photograph sitting on the dresser. Emily smiled back from the picture. The same smile he remembered every day. The same smile Grace was slowly beginning to inherit. "Long day," Ethan whispered. The room remained silent. Yet somehow he still felt less alone after speaking. Across the city, Olivia stood inside her dark kitchen, holding a cup of water she had barely touched. The mansion felt enormous. Empty. Quiet in all the wrong ways. Her phone buzzed repeatedly with missed calls and messages from employees, board members, and associates. She ignored every one of them. Instead, she found herself thinking about a man with an old pickup truck who had refused to ask for anything. The memory made no sense. She barely knew him, yet the encounter lingered. Eventually, she walked upstairs toward her bedroom. As she passed a hallway lined with family photographs, her eyes briefly settled on an image of her mother taken years earlier. Something about the feeling in her chest tightened unexpectedly. She looked away almost immediately. Certain memories were easier left untouched. Yet as rain continued tapping softly against the windows, Neither Olivia nor Ethan realized that their brief encounter was already setting invisible pieces into motion. Pieces connected to old photographs, forgotten histories, and a past that neither of them was prepared to face. The next morning began like every other morning in Ethan Walker's world. The alarm rang at 6. Coffee brewed in the tiny kitchen. Lunches were packed. Shoes were searched for. Homework was checked one final time. The ordinary rhythm of fatherhood filled the apartment long before the sun fully rose above the city. Grace sat at the kitchen table swinging her feet beneath the chair while finishing a bowl of cereal. "You look tired," she announced. Ethan laughed softly. "That is because I am tired. You should sleep more." "That is excellent advice. You should listen to it." Her serious expression made him smile. Grace possessed a gift for sounding wise beyond her years. Sometimes it felt like Emily was speaking through her. The thought lingered as Ethan placed a lunch bag beside her backpack. Across the city, Olivia Bennett's morning looked entirely different. Her schedule was packed with meetings, presentations, and decisions involving millions of dollars. Yet she found herself distracted. During a boardroom presentation, her attention drifted toward the rain streaking across the windows. During a conference call, she caught herself remembering the warmth of an old pickup truck and a stranger who had treated her with simple kindness. It made no sense. She barely knew the man. By every measure, their worlds should never have crossed. Yet the memory remained. Around noon, Olivia opened a file on her tablet containing reports she had ignored the previous night. One notification caught her attention. Security records from the hotel. Transportation logs. Incident reports. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she spotted a brief mention describing a guest who had left with a private citizen after refusing medical assistance. The report included a vehicle description and license plate number. Olivia stared at the screen longer than necessary. She could have closed the file and continued her day. Instead, she found herself asking an assistant to locate the vehicle owner. The request felt irrational even as she made it. 2 hours later, a name appeared on her desk. Ethan Walker, 40 years old, delivery contractor, widower, 1 child. Olivia read the summary twice. Nothing about it explained why she felt compelled to learn more. Yet curiosity continued growing. Meanwhile, Ethan spent the afternoon delivering supplies across the city. The day passed without incident until his phone rang shortly before school dismissal. Seeing Grace's elementary school on the screen immediately tightened his chest. Parents rarely receive calls from school for good reasons. "Hello, Mr. Walker," a cheerful voice answered. "Do not worry. Grace is fine." Relief arrived instantly. "Okay, there is a family heritage project due next week. Grace forgot to tell you." Ethan laughed. "That sounds like Grace. Students need photographs and stories about relatives." After the call ended, Ethan sat quietly for several moments. Family heritage. The words carried unexpected weight. Grace had asked questions before. Questions about Emily. Questions about grandparents she had never met. Questions Ethan never knew how to answer completely. Emily had spoken very little about her family before they married. The subject often seemed painful. Then life moved forward. Jobs, parenthood, responsibilities, and eventually grief. Some chapters simply remained closed. That evening, Ethan and Grace searched through old storage boxes in the apartment closet. Dust covered several containers that had not been opened for years. Grace sat cross-legged on the floor examining photographs while Ethan sorted through faded envelopes and keepsakes. "Mom was pretty," Grace said. Ethan smiled. "She was. I think I look like her." "You definitely do." Grace held up a photograph. Emily stood beside Ethan on a windy beach, laughing at something outside the frame. For a moment the room felt strangely still. Memories returned in quiet waves. The sound of Emily's voice, her smile, the dreams they once shared. Then Grace reached for another photograph. "Who are these people?" Ethan looked closer. The image showed Emily years before they met. She appeared younger, standing beside several individuals Ethan did not recognize. The picture had been tucked behind other photos as if someone had forgotten it existed. "I am not sure," Ethan admitted. Grace studied the image. Maybe they are family. Maybe. Yet something about the photograph unsettled him. He could not explain why. Across town, Olivia sat alone in her office long after employees had gone home. Ethan's background report remained open on her computer screen. Beside it sat an old framed picture of her mother taken decades earlier. Olivia barely noticed her fingers tracing the edge of the frame. Some instinct she could not name kept whispering that the stranger from the storm was connected to something larger. Something forgotten. Something waiting. And neither of them realized that among the photographs scattered across a small apartment floor, one faded image had already begun pulling the past toward the present. The photograph stayed on Ethan's mind long after Grace went to bed. He sat alone at the kitchen table beneath the soft glow of a single lamp, turning the faded picture over in his hands. There was no date written on the back, no names, just Emily standing among people he had never met. The longer he studied their faces, the stranger he felt. They did not look like distant acquaintances. They looked comfortable around her, familiar, connected. Yet during all the years they spent together, Emily had rarely spoken about her family. Whenever the subject appeared, a shadow crossed her expression. Ethan had never pushed. Love sometimes meant respecting unopened doors. Eventually, he placed the photograph aside and prepared for bed, unaware that someone else in Dallas was staring at a different photograph while asking equally difficult questions. Olivia sat across from her mother the following afternoon inside a quiet restaurant overlooking a lake. Margaret Bennett rarely accepted lunch invitations during the workweek. She preferred routine and privacy. Yet something in Olivia's voice had sounded unusual during the phone call. Concerned. Distracted. "You have barely touched your food," Margaret observed. Olivia smiled faintly. "You noticed?" "I always notice." For several moments they watched ducks move across the water beyond the windows. Then Olivia surprised herself by mentioning Ethan. Not every detail. Just enough. The rainstorm. The stranger who had helped her. The unusual kindness. Margaret listened quietly. "And now you are investigating him?" she asked. Olivia sighed. "When you say it like that, it sounds ridiculous." "Is it?" Olivia stared into her coffee. "I do not know." Margaret studied her daughter carefully. Olivia had spent years building walls around herself. Success made that easier. Trust became harder. Yet something about this conversation reminded Margaret of a younger version of her daughter. Before grief. Before disappointments. Before the endless pressure of leadership. "Maybe you are curious because kindness has become rare," Margaret said softly. The comment lingered. Olivia did not answer. Later that evening, Ethan arrived at Grace's school for a family heritage event. The cafeteria buzzed with parents, teachers, and children displaying projects about their ancestors. Posters covered the walls. Family trees stood on folding tables. Photographs stretched across presentation boards. Grace proudly guided Ethan toward her display. "Look." He smiled immediately. She had arranged pictures of Emily, herself, and Ethan with careful attention. Construction paper hearts surrounded handwritten stories. One section remained mostly empty. "What goes there?" Ethan asked. Grace glanced down. "Mom's family." The words landed gently but heavily. Ethan crouched beside her. "I am sorry we do not know more." Grace nodded. "It is okay." Yet he could see disappointment hiding behind the brave smile. At that moment, another voice interrupted. "That project looks beautiful." Ethan turned. Olivia stood several feet away. For a second, he genuinely wondered whether he was imagining her. Grace's eyes widened. "Dad, who is that?" Olivia smiled warmly. "A friend." Ethan almost laughed at the description. They had spoken for less than an hour in total. Yet somehow it did not feel entirely wrong. Olivia explained that her company sponsored several educational programs throughout the district, and she had stopped by to visit one of the schools. The explanation sounded reasonable. Still, Ethan sensed there was more behind her presence. Grace immediately began showing off every detail of her project. Olivia listened with genuine attention. She asked questions, complimented drawings, encouraged stories. Watching the interaction felt strangely natural. Then Grace held up the faded photograph from the storage box. "We found this," she said proudly. "But Dad does not know who these people are." Olivia accepted the picture. Her smile faded slightly. Not because she recognized anyone. She did not. Yet something about the image caught her attention. Specifically one piece of jewelry worn by a woman standing near Emily. A necklace. Simple. Elegant. Familiar. Olivia stared an extra second before handing the photograph back. "Interesting picture," she said carefully. Ethan noticed the hesitation. "What is it?" Olivia shook her head. "Probably nothing." Yet even as she spoke, uncertainty flickered across her face. After the event ended, she drove directly to her mother's house, carrying a photograph she had secretly taken with her phone. Margaret welcomed her inside and listened as Olivia explained what happened. Then Olivia opened the image. Margaret adjusted her glasses and leaned closer. At first she said nothing. Seconds passed, then more. The color slowly drained from her face. Her hand tightened around the edge of the table. Olivia felt her pulse quicken. "Mom." Margaret continued staring at the photograph. The room seemed to grow unnaturally quiet. Finally, she whispered for words that neither of them expected. "I have seen this before." And for the first time, a mystery that had slept quietly for years began to wake. Margaret Bennett did not speak for several seconds after those 4 words left her mouth. The silence felt heavy enough to change the air in the room. Olivia watched her mother carefully. In all her years, she had rarely seen Margaret look unsettled. Her mother was the kind of woman who remained composed during crises, business failures, family losses, and personal disappointments. Yet now she stared at the photograph as though it had reached across time and touched something she had spent years trying to forget. "What do you mean you have seen it before?" Olivia asked quietly. Margaret swallowed. Her eyes remained fixed on the image displayed on the phone screen. "Not this exact photograph." She paused. "But that necklace." Olivia felt a chill. "The necklace?" Margaret nodded slowly. "The woman standing beside Emily is wearing a necklace that belonged to someone I once knew very well." The answer only created more questions. Olivia pulled out a chair and sat across from her mother. "Who?" Margaret looked away from the photograph. For a moment, she seemed unsure how much to say. "A long time ago, before you were born, there was someone very important to our family." Olivia waited. Margaret rarely spoke about the past in detail. "What happened?" The older woman sighed deeply. "Life happened." The response sounded incomplete. Olivia knew it immediately, yet she also recognized something else. Pain. Real pain. The kind that survives decades. Outside, evening sunlight faded across the neighborhood. Inside the house, old memories slowly began pushing against doors that had remained closed for years. "Can you tell me her name?" Olivia asked. Margaret hesitated. Then she stood and walked toward a hallway closet. Several moments later, she returned carrying a weathered storage box. Dust covered the corners. The cardboard looked fragile with age. Olivia watched quietly as her mother opened it. Inside were photographs, greeting cards, letters, and keepsakes from another era. Margaret carefully sorted through them. Finally, she stopped. Her hand trembled slightly as she pulled out an old photograph. Olivia leaned forward. The woman in the picture appeared young and smiling, standing beside Margaret, standing beside a younger version of a man Olivia barely recognized. The resemblance was distant but unmistakable. "Family. Who is she?" Olivia whispered. Margaret's voice softened. Her name was Emily. Olivia felt her heartbeat stumble. "Emily?" Margaret nodded. "Yes." The room became completely silent. Neither woman spoke for several seconds. Olivia stared at the image. The young woman in the photograph looked remarkably similar to the Emily she had seen in Grace's family project. Not identical. The photograph was older, yet the resemblance felt impossible to ignore. "Mom," Olivia began carefully. "Are you saying?" Margaret closed her eyes briefly. "I do not know what I am saying yet." That answer frightened Olivia more than certainty would have. Across the city, Ethan remained unaware that old family histories were quietly awakening. His evening consisted of far simpler concerns. He sat beside Grace at the kitchen table, helping her study vocabulary words. She struggled with one in particular. "Heritage," she read slowly. "What exactly does that mean?" Ethan considered the question. "It means where we come from. The people who came before us." Grace thought about that. "Even if we never met them?" "Especially then." She nodded thoughtfully. Then her expression changed. "Do you ever wish Mom was still here?" Ethan looked down at the workbook. Some questions never became easier. They simply became familiar. Every day, Grace reached for his hand. The gesture felt so much like Emily that Ethan momentarily lost his breath. "Me too," she whispered. Later that night, after Grace fell asleep, Ethan found himself examining the old photograph again. Something about it refused to leave his mind. He noticed details he had overlooked before. Faces, clothing, a building in the background, the necklace worn by the woman standing near Emily. It seemed oddly distinctive, almost memorable, yet he could not understand why. Hundreds of miles of invisible history separated him from the answers. Meanwhile, Margaret sat alone in her living room long after Olivia had gone home. The old photograph rested in her lap. Tears glistened in her eyes. She had not cried while looking at this image in years. Carefully, she opened one of the letters from the storage box. The paper had yellowed with age. The handwriting remained familiar. Every word carried echoes of a relationship lost long ago. A family divided by misunderstandings, pride, and silence. Margaret read the first few lines before closing her eyes. Emily, she whispered softly into the empty room. For years, she had believed certain chapters of her life were permanently closed. Yet now a stranger named Ethan Walker and a little girl named Grace had somehow brought those chapters back. And as questions multiplied across both families, one thing became increasingly clear. The photograph was not an accident. It was a clue, a quiet thread connecting people who had no idea how deeply their lives had already become intertwined. The following week unfolded beneath a growing sense of unease that none of them could fully explain. Questions had appeared, but answers remained just beyond reach. And sometimes uncertainty was harder to carry than certainty itself. Margaret spent most of those days sorting through old boxes she had not opened in years. Every photograph seemed to reveal another forgotten detail. Every letter reopened memories she had carefully locked away. Olivia visited several evenings in a row, something she had not done in months. Together, they sat at the dining room table surrounded by faded envelopes and family albums. The process felt less like research and more like excavation. Piece by piece, an old story emerged from beneath decades of silence. One evening, Margaret unfolded a letter with trembling hands. The paper looked fragile enough to break apart. "This one arrived almost 15 years ago," she said quietly. Olivia watched her mother read. Tears slowly filled Margaret's eyes. "What does it say?" Olivia asked. Margaret hesitated before answering. "It is from Emily." The room became still. Olivia leaned forward. Margaret continued reading silently for several moments before lowering the page. She wanted reconciliation. Olivia felt her chest tighten. Then why did everything end the way it did? Margaret looked down. Because sometimes people miss the moment when healing is still possible. The answer carried a weight that seemed larger than the room itself. Across town, Ethan's life continued moving according to familiar routines. Work, home, Grace, repeat. Yet the old photograph never completely left his thoughts. During deliveries, he found himself replaying conversations from years ago. Small details he had once ignored. Fragments of stories Emily had almost told him before changing the subject. One afternoon, he stopped by a storage facility where several remaining boxes from his old house were kept. The visit had no specific purpose. Just a feeling. A quiet instinct pulling him toward unfinished memories. Dust drifted through narrow beams of sunlight as he opened the unit. Most of the contents were ordinary. Holiday decorations, furniture, old clothing. Then, tucked inside a plastic container, he found something unexpected. A bundle of letters secured with a faded ribbon. Ethan immediately recognized Emily's handwriting. His pulse quickened. He sat on an overturned crate and carefully opened the first envelope. The words inside carried affection, regret, and longing. Yet they were not addressed to him. They were addressed to someone named Margaret. Ethan frowned. He read another, then another. Each letter told a similar story. Attempts to reconnect. Attempts to explain. Attempts to repair something broken. Yet none appeared to have been mailed. The envelopes remained sealed. Ethan stared at them in stunned silence. If Emily had written these letters, why had she never sent them? More importantly, who was Margaret? Hundreds of questions rushed through his mind. That night, he barely slept. Meanwhile, Olivia experienced troubles of her own. Her company faced growing pressure from investors. Meetings became longer. Expectations became heavier. Yet whenever she tried focusing on business, her thoughts returned to Ethan and the strange connections surrounding his late wife. Logic told her to walk away. Curiosity refused. Several days later, she made a decision. She called Ethan. The request felt simple enough. Coffee. Conversation. Nothing more. Ethan almost declined. Life already felt complicated enough. Yet something in Olivia's voice convinced him otherwise. They met at a small cafe near a public park. Rain clouds gathered overhead, reminding both of them of the night they first met. Olivia arrived first. Ethan joined her several minutes later carrying a folder. They exchanged polite greetings before settling into an awkward silence. Finally, Olivia spoke. I have been looking into something. Ethan gave a small laugh. That makes two of us. Their eyes met. Both immediately realized the other was carrying pieces of the same mystery. Ethan placed the folder on the table. Inside were copies of Emily's unsent letters. Olivia stared at the handwriting. Recognition flickered across her face. Not because she had seen the letters before, but because she had seen that signature recently among the documents Margaret had recovered. The coincidence felt impossible. Ethan noticed her reaction. You know something? Olivia looked away briefly, then back at him. Maybe. The answer offered little comfort. Around them, afternoon traffic moved through the city. Coffee cups cooled untouched. Questions multiplied faster than answers. Somewhere beyond those questions lay a truth connected to Emily, Margaret, and years of silence. Yet neither Ethan nor Olivia could see the full picture. Not yet. They only knew that the past was no longer staying buried. And with every new discovery, the distance between two separate families seemed to grow smaller than either of them ever imagined. The conversation at the cafe ended without clear answers. Yet both Ethan and Olivia left carrying a deeper sense that their lives had become connected by something neither of them fully understood. The city continued moving around them as if nothing had changed. Cars filled highways. Meetings filled calendars. Children attended school. But beneath the ordinary rhythm of daily life, old truths were slowly moving toward the surface. 3 days later, Olivia received a call from her mother. Margaret's voice sounded different. Softer. More emotional. I found something, she said. Olivia drove across town immediately. When she arrived, she found family photographs spread across the dining room table once again. Margaret sat quietly beside them, holding a small notebook. Its worn cover suggested it had survived many years. Where did you get that? Olivia asked. It was hidden inside one of the storage boxes. Margaret carefully opened the notebook. Pages filled with handwritten entries appeared. Some were dated nearly 20 years earlier. Olivia sat down slowly. Whose journal is it? Margaret looked at her daughter. The answer seemed difficult to say. Emily's. The room fell silent. Olivia felt her pulse quicken. Margaret began reading selected passages aloud. Most entries described ordinary moments. Dreams. Fears. Hopes for the future. Yet as the pages continued, a painful pattern emerged. Emily repeatedly wrote about wanting reconciliation. She described writing letters, making calls, waiting for responses that never seemed to arrive. She wrote about misunderstandings growing larger with time. She wrote about feeling trapped between pride and heartbreak. Olivia listened without speaking. Every page seemed to challenge assumptions her family had carried for years. Meanwhile, Ethan found himself facing a different kind of pressure. Grace had become increasingly curious about the family history project. The more information they uncovered, the more questions she asked. Questions Ethan struggled to answer. One evening, she sat beside him on the apartment couch, holding the old photograph. Do you think Mom wanted us to know these people? She asked. Ethan stared at the image for several seconds. I do not know. Maybe she was waiting for the right time. The innocence of the comment struck him deeply. Children often saw truths adults complicated. Ethan looked toward the framed photograph of Emily resting on a nearby shelf. Sometimes he wondered how many conversations they would have if she were still here. How many questions would finally have answers? The following weekend brought another unexpected development. Olivia asked if she could visit Ethan and Grace. The request surprised him. Yet Grace enthusiastically approved before he could answer. By Saturday afternoon, Olivia found herself climbing the stairs to their modest apartment, carrying a box of pastries from a local bakery. The visit felt strangely natural despite the unusual circumstances. Grace immediately took charge. She gave a tour of the apartment, shared school stories, displayed artwork, introduced every stuffed animal by name. Olivia found herself laughing more than she had in months. Ethan noticed. So did Grace. At one point, Grace disappeared into her room and returned carrying a small photo album. These are my favorites, she announced. Olivia accepted the album. Page after page revealed moments from a life built around love rather than wealth. Birthday parties, camping trips, school performances, family dinners, ordinary memories, beautiful memories. Then Olivia reached a page showing Emily holding Grace as a baby. Something about the image stopped her cold. Not because of Emily. Because of a piece of jewelry visible around her neck. The same necklace. The one Margaret had recognized. Olivia felt a chill move through her chest. Ethan noticed immediately. "Are you okay?" She nodded too quickly. "Yes." But her mind was racing. The necklace appeared again in another photograph. Then another. Always present. Always visible. Too significant to ignore. Later that evening, after Olivia returned home, she drove directly to Margaret's house carrying copies of the photographs. Margaret studied them quietly. The longer she looked, the more emotional she became. Finally, she closed her eyes. There is no coincidence here. Olivia sat across from her. Then what does it mean? Margaret looked toward the window where darkness had settled over the neighborhood. It means someone spent years believing a story that was never completely true. The statement lingered heavily between them. Neither woman spoke for several moments. Somewhere across Dallas, Ethan tucked Grace into bed and wished her good night. Somewhere else, Margaret sat surrounded by memories she could no longer ignore. And somewhere in the growing space between past and present, a painful misunderstanding that had shaped multiple lives for years was beginning to crack. Not enough to reveal the whole truth. Not yet, but enough to let a small amount of light through. The truth was close enough to touch now, yet somehow it felt farther away than ever. Every answer uncovered another layer of questions. Every discovery revealed how much pain had accumulated during years of silence. And perhaps that was the hardest part. Nobody had acted out of cruelty. Nobody had planned the damage. Life had simply carried people in different directions until distance became misunderstanding and misunderstanding became history. The following Monday, Olivia arrived unexpectedly at Ethan's apartment carrying a folder. Her expression alone told him this was not a casual visit. Grace was at school. The apartment felt unusually quiet. Ethan invited her inside. Neither sat immediately. The tension in the room felt too heavy. Finally, Olivia placed the folder on the kitchen table. "My mother found more records." Ethan studied her face. "Good records or bad records?" Olivia released a slow breath. "I do not know yet." She opened the folder. Inside were copies of old correspondence, address records, and notes collected from family archives. Ethan carefully reviewed the pages. Some names appeared familiar from Emily's journal. Others did not. Yet one detail stood out immediately. Multiple attempts at communication had existed from both sides. Letters, messages, phone records, efforts that neither party seemed to know about. Ethan looked up slowly. Emily thought nobody answered. Olivia nodded. And my mother believed Emily stopped responding. Silence followed. Neither person knew what to do with that realization. Years of separation built upon assumptions. Years of grief resting on incomplete information. Ethan leaned back in his chair. For the first time, genuine frustration appeared in his expression. Not anger. Something sadder. The realization that suffering sometimes grows from mistakes nobody notices until it is too late. Across town, Margaret sat alone in her study reviewing the final pages of Emily's recovered journal. Tears blurred portions of the handwriting. Some entries described loneliness. Others described hope. One particular passage forced Margaret to stop reading altogether. Emily had written about wanting her future children to know every side of their family someday. The sentence shattered something inside her. For years, Margaret had accepted the story she believed. A story of rejection and distance. Now that certainty was disappearing. In its place came regret. That evening, Margaret made a decision she had delayed for too long. She asked Olivia to arrange a meeting. Not immediately. Not dramatically. Simply a dinner. A chance for conversation. A chance to place all remaining pieces on the table. Olivia understood the significance immediately. So did Ethan when she called him later that night. He stood by the apartment window, listening quietly. Outside, city lights shimmered beneath a darkening sky. "Are you sure?" he asked. "My mother is." Ethan remained silent. The invitation carried weight far beyond a simple meal. It represented history, questions, possibilities, perhaps even healing. Yet it also carried risk. What if the answers hurt more than the uncertainty? What if old wounds reopened? After the call ended, Ethan found Grace sitting cross-legged on the living room floor working on a drawing. "You look serious," she announced. He smiled faintly. "Maybe I am." She studied him. "Is it about Mom?" The question surprised him. "Why would you think that?" Grace shrugged. Because every time you look at that photograph, you get the same face. Children noticed everything. Ethan sat beside her. Maybe it is. Grace rested her head against his shoulder. I think Mom would want everybody to be friends. The simplicity of the statement nearly broke his heart. Meanwhile, Olivia sat across from her mother in the large dining room that suddenly felt much smaller than usual. Margaret looked older than she had only weeks earlier. Not weaker, just burdened by memories she could no longer avoid. Do you think he will come? Margaret asked softly. Olivia knew exactly who she meant. Yes. Margaret nodded. Her eyes drifted toward an old family photograph resting nearby. I have rehearsed this conversation for days. And? Olivia asked. A sad smile appeared. There is no perfect way to apologize to people who never knew they deserved one. The words lingered heavily between them. Outside, evening settled across the city. In one home, Ethan tucked Grace into bed and stared at Emily's photograph long after the lights were out. In another, Margaret sat awake reviewing memories that had shaped decades of her life. Olivia moved between both worlds, feeling the invisible thread connecting them grow tighter with every passing hour. The dinner was scheduled for Friday evening. For days away. For days before questions that had survived years would finally face answers. For days before strangers connected by loss, family, and fate would sit across the same table. And as each of them counted down the days in their own way, one truth became impossible to ignore. Whatever happened on Friday would change all of their lives forever. Friday arrived carrying a quiet kind of gravity. No storms rolled across the city. No dramatic signs appeared in the sky. Yet for Ethan, Olivia, and Margaret, the day felt larger than any ordinary day should. Years of unanswered questions had led to this moment. Years of silence were finally approaching a voice. Ethan drove to the Bennett home just before sunset. Grace sat beside him in the passenger seat, unusually quiet for once. She stared out the window as neighborhoods passed by. Are you nervous? Ethan asked gently. Grace nodded. A little. Ethan smiled softly. Me too. The truth was that he had never felt more uncertain. Not because he feared confrontation. He feared disappointment. After everything they had uncovered, he wanted to believe there was meaning behind it all. He wanted to believe Emily's story deserved peace. When they arrived, Olivia greeted them at the door. Her usual confidence seemed replaced by something more human, more vulnerable. She smiled warmly at Grace and led them inside. Margaret waited in the dining room. The moment she saw Ethan and Grace, emotion filled her eyes. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Years of distance stood silently between people who had never truly known each other. Then Grace did something no adult would have thought to do. She walked forward and hugged Margaret. The room seemed to stop. Margaret's shoulders trembled as she carefully wrapped her arms around the little girl. Tears immediately appeared. Hello, Grace said softly. Margaret laughed through tears. Hello, sweetheart. The simple kindness broke the tension that had gripped everyone. They sat together around the table. Conversation began cautiously, then slowly grew deeper. Documents were shared. Letters were opened. Journal entries were discussed. Piece by piece, the truth emerged. Emily had never stopped trying to reconnect. Margaret had never stopped hoping for contact. Messages had been lost. Addresses had changed. Assumptions had replaced communication. Pride had filled the empty spaces where conversations should have existed. Nobody had intentionally turned away. Nobody had chosen separation. Instead, a series of small misunderstandings had grown into years of distance. As the realization settled over the room, Margaret finally looked directly at Ethan. Her voice shook. I lost my daughter long before I lost the chance to know her again. Tears streamed down her face. And I cannot change that. Ethan remained silent. Margaret continued. But I should have tried harder. I should have looked longer. I should have listened better. The words carried no excuses. Only truth. Ethan glanced toward a photograph of Emily resting on the table. Then he looked back at Margaret. Emily never stopped loving her family. Margaret lowered her head as tears fell freely. Across the table, Olivia quietly reached for her mother's hand. For the first time in years, old wounds were not being defended. They were being acknowledged. Sometimes healing begins there. Not with perfection, not with explanations, simply with honesty. As the evening continued, stories replaced sadness. Margaret shared memories of Emily as a child. Grace listened with wide eyes. Ethan listened even more carefully. For years he had wondered about parts of Emily's life he never knew. Now those missing pieces finally had voices. Laughter occasionally interrupted tears. Old photographs moved from hand to hand. The distance between strangers slowly disappeared. Hours passed without anyone noticing. At one point, Grace climbed into Margaret's lap while looking through family albums. Neither seemed eager to move. Ethan watched quietly from across the room. A warmth settled inside him that he had not felt in years. Not because the past had changed. It never could. Emily was still gone. The losses remained real. But something else had appeared alongside grief. Connection. Family. Second chances for the people still here. Later that evening, as they prepared to leave, Margaret stopped Ethan near the doorway. "Thank you," she whispered. Ethan looked surprised. "For what?" Margaret smiled through tears. "For bringing her home." Ethan followed her gaze toward Grace. The little girl stood laughing with Olivia in the hallway. For a moment, Ethan understood exactly what Margaret meant. Not just Grace. Not just the family connection. Emily herself. In a quiet way, the woman they both loved had finally brought everyone back together. Weeks later, new traditions began forming naturally. Sunday dinners, school events, phone calls, shared holidays. Nothing forced, nothing dramatic. Just people choosing one another after years apart. And sometimes that is what redemption looks like. Not grand gestures. Not miracles falling from the sky. Just ordinary people deciding that love matters more than old pain. On a warm spring afternoon, Ethan stood beside Grace in a park while she played with a kite. Nearby, Margaret and Olivia sat together beneath a tree. Laughter drifted across the grass. Sunlight touched everything with gentle warmth. Ethan looked upward and thought about Emily. Not with the sharp ache that once followed every memory. This time it felt different. Peaceful. As though somewhere beyond sight, she finally knew her family had found each other again. And perhaps the greatest gift she left behind was not a mystery waiting to be solved. It was a path leading broken hearts back together. If this story touched something in your heart, take a moment to share your thoughts below. Tell us about a second chance, a reunion, or a relationship that changed your life. And if stories of quiet dignity, grace, and healing remind you that hope is never truly lost, we would be honored if you stayed with us for more journeys like this one. Sometimes one simple act of kindness can change far more lives than we ever imagined.